so the next one we're going to be taking a look at is Guard. And surprisingly, this is one of the very few animes I actually own on a box set. In fact, you're looking at the picture of it right now. And I'm sure that most people that actually own box sets and anime DVDs will understand that a lot of this shit brand new is expensive. Well, anyways, I never heard of the show until I randomly found it at the thrift store at my old place. And it happens to be a mecha slash science fiction slash comedy. Yeah, it seems like I've been doing a lot of science fiction stuff this year. Well, anyways, let's now talk about the story. So it mostly takes place in a company called the 21st Century Defense Security Corporation, and there are three main characters, and they happen to be Akage. Now he's the kind of character who's always caring for others and wants to try and do the best thing for it, but he's always reckless in doing so. And then there's Ibuki, who is very straightforward with most people, mostly towards her stepfather, but she is very good with small details. And finally there is Oyama. Now he's the character who's always like hitting on a bunch of ladies, and of course by having that mentality a lot of people think he's a womanizer. Also because he always goes off work early and most people think that he's doing it just to meet some girl. But in reality he's actually visiting his sick mother. So these three characters were just regular everyday office workers. But during one of the events that was going on, some giant monster attacks, and the monsters are called the Heterodynes. And these monsters are formed whenever an earthquake happens. So after the first one is about to attack the event, everyone is just evacuating the area, except for these three main characters. Well, the one that had the whole bright idea about this was Akage, but anyways. In the event, there is a mech called Guard that is just there, and the reason why it's there is because it was being used as a marketing ploy. But its main purpose is supposed to fight the Heterodynes. So Akage ends up just taking it out with any authorization, and he ends up getting the other two to join in. Because the mech Guard actually requires 3 people to pilot it, and Akage always had really big interest in piloting the Guard, so of course this is another big chance for him to do so. So after launching it, they mostly try and save all the pedestrians by making some exits, and while at the same time they're also trying to back off the Heterodynes. But after pushing it back, they end up getting Guard very damaged, and same thing with the whole city. So after when they return to work, they have to do a whole bunch of paperwork. And while the big corporates are angry at them because they're a bunch of pedestrians that were not supposed to do that, they ended up making them pilots because they ended up actually doing a pretty good job at defending them, even if a bunch of shit got broken. So they still get to do their boring ass office work, but at the same time whenever a call needs to get in, they are allowed to pilot Guard. Now one character I would like to mention that I do feel is pretty important is Shirota. He was originally an army officer, but then he got changed to a tactical advisor ever since that whole incident happened. He's always very strict with everyone around him, and he hardly has any emotions at all. Especially when someone else is in danger because of the Heterodynes, he's always like, okay, you gotta destroy the Heterodynes, but oh, that person that's like about to die? Yeah, fuck them. But of course, Akage is the kind of person where he wants to save the person, and then after that, he wants to destroy the Heterodyne. In other words, he really likes taking risks. Well, Akage does anyway. Now there are plenty of other characters, like there's the corporals, then there's like the other office members, and even the characters that actually work on Guard himself. So I think I got the basics of this one. I mean, it's pretty much just about a bunch of office workers who happen to pilot a mech. Well, they have to fight off a bunch of monsters called the Heterodynes, and they have to deal with some damage control, lawsuits, and even some military group that is trying to steal Guard away from them. Now, before I give out my thoughts on the story, one thing I would like to say is that this show kinda does remind me of EVA a little bit. Mostly because of the giant mech that has to defend the city from a bunch of monsters. In fact, if you look at the page for EVA, there's quite a few random things that are in there that are inspired by EVA, and this one happened to be in there. So it is kinda funny that I did take a look at this and EVA in the same feature. And if you watched all my reviews in order for this year, then you've already watched my review for EVA, and well, as you know, I thought the show was just decent, but it did have some good moments, but it also had some things in it that I didn't really care for. But as for the story in this one, I think it's actually not too bad. Now I know the concepts of it are not like all that original. Now one thing that is kinda interesting with this one is that one of the main focuses is not so much on the mech stuff. I mean, yeah, that's a big part of it, but the other big part of it would have to be the office work stuff, because it pretty much tells you that there's a lot of hardships that happen when you're working in an office. Which is kind of an interesting idea, even though it was a bit boring at the beginning, at least it did get better. And of course, I think the characters help out with this one as well. Now, they may not be like the most compelling looking characters ever, but I just think that the development, the interactions are just really well done. And I find that really makes up for it. Also, the show has a lot of funny parts in it as well, which is always a nice thing to have. But the kind of funny stuff that's in this one isn't like anything over the top, but it is pretty funny enough. But I think it suits right for this kind of show. I mean, one of the subgenres for it is comedy after all. So for the overall story, I actually think it's pretty good. Not amazing, but actually pretty good enough. So now let's talk about the animation. And it's not too bad. I mean, the action scenes actually look good, but as for everything else, yeah, it looks okay. I mean, it's nothing outstanding, but it's nothing that I'd really make such a big deal out of. And like I said about the characters not looking compelling enough, well, yeah, I do have to say the character designs are not really the greatest thing ever, but at least they did make a trade-off of making characters that may not look great but are actually likable, rather than having characters that look awesome but are really just a big mess. But as for the overall animation, I'd say it's not bad. Now as for the music in this show, I'd say it's okay. It's nothing too memorable, but it does suit the show okay, so yeah, nothing a whole lot I can complain about there. But as for the opening, well, all I have to say is ba 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 ba, or some shit like that. Yeah, that's mostly what it consists of, and well, it's not really a great opening, but it isn't terrible either. At least it does sound upbeat, so at least that's good. But overall, I'd say it's just okay, so I'll give it a pass. Now, as for the voice acting, if you're watching this in English, it's pretty poor if I say so myself. Now, I wouldn't say that the dub for this one is not nearly as bad as it was for Card Captors, but it still isn't very good at all. I mean, for one, I don't even recognize any of the voice actors. I mean, whenever I look up their names after the credits, I just can never find any info on them. But as for the voices themselves, I mean, a lot of them are either very annoying, very dull sounding, and just sound like they're just bored with the whole thing. Well, I can understand Shirata being bored because he's kind of emotionless, but as for most of the other people, yeah, that's pretty much what it's like. But as for the main cast, though, I do find that it is okay. I mean, it's at least better than most of the other characters, I'll guarantee you that. But sometimes it can sound pretty dry, so yeah, it just isn't anything spectacular. So overall, the voice acting is pretty poor, but is not the worst thing ever. Now, as for the overall score, I think I'm going to give this one a 7 out of 10. I do find that the show is pretty good, even if it does have a lot of slow moments, but at least the characters do make up for it, and the action scenes are pretty good. Even though one thing I forgot to mention of animation is that I do find that the mech Digard actually kind of looks a lot like Mazinger Z a little bit. But it is an okay design, even though I kind of wish they went for something more original, but at least the weapons that do replace his arms are kind of cool. But I do find that the show was pretty fun enough. It wasn't anything overly amazing, but it was at least pretty good. I mean, I like the characters in them, and it did have some pretty interesting ideas for the show. Now, if you're watching this one after watching that one I did for EVA, yeah, clearly I'll like this one a bit better. Now, I'm sure that a lot of you guys out there that are watching this are probably going to disagree with me on that, but hey, that's okay. Now, I'm not trying to compare the two all the time, but just because this show did take some inspirations from EVA, that's why I'm kind of making that reference. So with all that aside, I found this one was pretty good, even though it was a bit slow at times. But it did have a good amount of funny parts that did keep me entertained. And I did like the characters and their interactions and stuff, so that's really all I needed from it. So after my first time watching this one, I'm actually pretty glad that it is actually a pretty good show. It may not be like the best mecha show you'll ever watch, but it at least does have an interesting point of view. So one last thing I have to say about this one is that I do consider it to be on the underrated side, mostly because I barely hear anyone ever talk about it. So nothing more to say other than that, yep, not bad at all.